coming on the air with that highest-ranking COVID diagnosis in the Biden administration so far after a positive test result for Vice President Kamala Harris. She says she's fine, but this could create a backlog temporarily in the Senate. How it might mean another challenge for the White House's return to normal push. Plus, we're bringing you two NBC News exclusives on Ukraine today. One on the intel the U.S. is giving to stop Russia's air attack. The other on a Ukrainian oligarch changing his tune on Vladimir Putin. What he's telling NBC News first on this show about the Kremlin. That's later in the original. And airlines are hoping to make some money this summer, but there's a catch. They don't have enough pilots to go around. But you might see one of your flights downgraded to a bus trip instead. Plus, the pandemic's burning out women who work fast, according to a new report first to NBC News. We've got the backstory with one of our reporters who's been covering women in the workplace for years. And Harvard tonight grappling with its ties to slavery, trying to right some of those wrongs with a new academic fund. What we're hearing now from the descendant of one enslaved person at the school later on in the show. Hey, I'm Hallie, and we start tonight with the White House. In the last couple minutes, defending its COVID protocols after Vice President Kamala Harris tested positive for the virus. The VP now becomes the highest-ranking official in the Biden administration to catch COVID. Listen, she's asymptomatic. She's double vaxxed. She's double boosted. So experts say she's almost certainly going to be fine while she isolates and keeps working from home. Officials say she has not been in close contact with the president or the first lady. That's been another question here. And the White House confirmed President Biden himself tested negative just yesterday. But they're not ruling anything out down the road. Listen.
I wouldn't say it's just a matter of time, but of course it is possible that the president, like any other American, could get COVID. The bottom line is he is vaccinated and boosted. He is very well protected. He's got very good protocols around him to protect him from getting infected. But there is no 100% anything. And I think the key focus has got to be we've got to continue protecting the president. That's what the protocols around him are designed to do.
The vice president's diagnosis is the latest in a string of infections in Washington over the past few weeks, shining a light on the administration's messaging about this return to normal with COVID. And then on the other end of Pennsylvania Avenue, showing just how fragile the Democrats' advantage in a 50-50 Senate really is, since Vice President Harris is off in the tie-breaking vote. Let's break that down into two pieces with Kelly O'Donnell, who's posted up outside the White House to talk about this. Kelly, I've been chatting with doctors this afternoon who still have some questions outstanding, like, is the vice president going to get any treatments, even though she is asymptomatic? And then what about protocols when it comes to the president, with the White House over the past couple of weeks really seeming to be foaming the runway just in case the president does get it by saying, hey, it's certainly possible. It's not out of the realm of possibility.
Well, they made a very conscious choice to begin to talk about COVID with respect to President Biden and Vice President Harris that way, which did alter people's expectations. And so perhaps that made today's news a little bit more expected. On the issue of whether Vice President Harris will take any therapeutic medications, the answer we've been given so far is that would be a decision she would make with her doctor. I think there is a case to be made that if she does, that would be the kind of information that could be made public as a part of not only her private medical circumstances, which she could make a decision about, but because it is such a big part of the messaging of this White House to talk about the availability of those drugs, that perhaps she will make the decision to make that public. At this point, we don't know the answer to that. She was not symptomatic at the time she took the test, which was a part of the routine pattern of testing before she was going to go into the Oval Office. That doesn't mean she wouldn't have symptoms at another point. We just don't know. At this point, her office says she will spend at least 5 days in isolation at her home, the vice president's residence, the Naval Observatory, as it's known here. And we will then get perhaps an update at that point about what she will do. So I think it's a legitimate question to press for, will she have any additional medical treatments? And will they make that public? And that's kind of new ground. They had committed to letting us know there would be a positive if one happened. They've done that. But it's a question about will they be forthcoming about treatments.
There are those who I think are saying or who might say, listen, either I've had COVID or I know somebody who's had COVID, like the vice president getting COVID. This is what happens in this day and age at this particular moment of where we are in this pandemic recovery. But there's a real sort of practical implication here, Kelly, beyond the sort of protocol questions as it relates to the most powerful person in the country, President Biden, who in any other instance, if she hadn't been traveling last week, would have seen her more frequently. There's also, the spotlight now on how fragile that 50-50 majority really is for Democrats in the Senate, because you have 2 Democratic senators who have also come down with COVID, and these tight nominations that the White House is trying to get through the Senate over the next week that are now going to have to be delayed.
They have to acknowledge they can't get it done if people can't show up to work. And in some ways, that's not any different than if a teacher can't be in the classroom or a fighter can't report for duty, or the kinds of disruptions people have seen in their office places. When it comes to high government officials, the consequences affect things like confirmation of appointments and important nominations in government. And so what we've seen is at least 2 Democratic senators are also out with COVID, and then the vice president who could serve as a tie-breaking vote. And so the White House acknowledges that with some of these Federal Reserve nominations for positions in the Federal Reserve structure, that will have to wait. There may be some nominations that were on the Senate calendar this week where there's enough of a margin where they don't need the vice president's vote, or that margin of at least 2 senators now who are unavailable. It'll have to wait if they don't have the votes. And so the White House has acknowledged that.
Yeah.
They're eager to get it done. But that's one of the realities. So not only is it the illness piece, it's the loss of productivity. And at the White House level, that productivity has a very far-reaching implication.
Kelly O'Donnell live for us there outside the White House. Kelly, glad you're staying on top of this story. I know if anybody is going to be asking the questions that we need to know, it is you, friend. Thank you.
Thank you.
Now to Ukraine, and some exclusive new reporting here on NBC News about the intel the U.S. is sharing with the Ukrainians to help them fight the Russians, with current and former officials telling our team the Pentagon's been giving detailed information about when and where Russia's going to hit. In some instances, giving the Ukrainians enough time to get out of the way. In others, paving the way for Ukraine to, for example, take down Russian planes. A National Security Council spokesperson telling us that the U.S. provides, in their words, detailed, timely intelligence to Ukraine. And it's all coming as the Kremlin is ramping up its threats. You had the Russian foreign minister, this guy you're seeing here, Sergei Lavrov. He's saying now that the risks of nuclear war, quote, cannot be underestimated. Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin says he's going to move heaven and earth to help Ukraine. And he clapped back at Lavrov. Listen.
That kind of rhetoric is very dangerous and unhelpful. Nobody wants to see a nuclear war happen.
Cal Perry is in Kyiv for us now. So, Cal, we talked about the intelligence that the U.S. is giving to Ukraine that helps them get a sense of, like, when and where Russia might be hitting from the air. But for a lot of people that you're talking with, it's too late. I know you spoke with a woman in Irpin who lost her house. You know, this is what's happening to people who live in this country, innocent people who are not part of this broader war.
Yeah, and I think it's important to talk about these millions of folks who are still on the move. 7.7 million people internally displaced across the country, and the stats are just stunning. 1 in 6. That's 1 in 6 Ukrainians. 600,000 of them just since the beginning of this month. And according to the UN, about 15% of them are now trying to return to their homes. You mentioned Irpin. Irpin is a suburb here in Kyiv, and it saw fierce fighting. It was the place, and one of the places, I should say, where the Ukrainian military and these defense forces, these civilian defense forces, were able to stop the Russian advancement. The reality of that, though, is you see what you're seeing on the left side of your screen. Destroyed neighborhoods, just completely and totally devastated. We had a chance to follow Olena. You see her there as she returned to her home for the first time. And for weeks, Hallie, she's been living just with what she can out of one plastic bag. Here's a little bit of what she had to say to us.
When they were shelling us, there was such a feeling that they are preparing a base area, and just how to say, honestly, there was nowhere to hide, and I asked God to kill me straight away.
And so you have an entire population that is literally shell-shocked, walking around with post-traumatic stress. And add to that, as you go to some of these places, so many of them are now mined. There are all these unexploded ordnances all over the ground. We actually saw what we think was a mortar round stuck into the ground where the pavement was. So it is a very dangerous situation as you have these folks trying to get back to their homes. And again, Hallie, as you can see, some of the homes are just now gone.
So it is, I think, so important to show, Cal, and to shine a light on what is still happening there, you know, more than a month after this war from Putin began, and weeks now after the city of Mariupol has been hit, right, with Ukraine's military reporting something like 35 strikes from the air on that steel plant that's been besieged just in the last 24 hours. How much, they're running out of food, they're running out of water. How much longer can they hold out this resistance for the Ukrainians?
So the government is saying this is now beyond a desperate situation, that they were running low on ammunition, for example, 24 hours ago. This has been going on now for more than a month. You're seeing pictures in and around near this steel plant where there are thousands of civilians still trapped. One of the other things that is happening there, we understand from the government, are these what they're calling abductions, these forced deportations. 474 people today from the city of Mariupol, according to the government, were forced to go to Russia. So it's a way that Russia, according to the Ukrainian government, is using civilians basically as pawns. You're seeing the video there from the basement of this steel plant. An entire nation is watching what is unfolding there because, again, you have these hundreds, if not thousands of civilians. On the military front, and I think this is pretty interesting, hearing from the Ukrainian military, they say they're actually slowing down the Russian advancement in the east by fighting them in Mariupol, that they're preventing Russian troops from pivoting to the east. So I think one of the fears is beyond the civilian casualties that could be incurred if this steel plant is taken, is that the Russians could then turn their full attention to that confrontation now taking place in the eastern part of the country, Hallie.
Cal Perry, it's good to have you on the ground in Kyiv. Good to see you again tonight, my friend. Thank you for being there. Turning back to some news back home, some breaking news out of Wall Street. So the markets dropping by more than 2% today. Check out the Dow, losing 800 points. The S&P 500, the NASDAQ, they're also down. The NASDAQ's actually down something like 4%. It's been kind of a yikes month. Only 6 days of gains in April. The S&P is on track for its worst month since March of 2020 when the pandemic first started. Let me bring in CNBC's Frank Holland, who's joining us now. What is, in super layman's terms, Frank, because, I'm a political reporter, not a business reporter, what is behind this? It seems like it's tech stocks, right, that are leading the decline.
It's absolutely tech stocks. I'm going to use a technical term. You used one of them. It's not only a yikes month, but it's kind of a yowza month. The big factor here is interest rate pressure. Tech stocks are especially hit hard by interest rate pressure. It reduces the value of their future earnings. A lot of them are high growth stocks, and that growth gets stunted the higher that interest rates go. But there's also a lot of geopolitical uncertainty. Obviously, the war in Ukraine, a factor, and then also the rising COVID cases in China, shutting down one of the biggest ports in the entire world in Shanghai, also the largest container port. Containers are how most of our consumer goods get into the country. You think Nikes and iPads. You put all that together, it's put a lot of pressure not only on tech, but stocks across the board. You mentioned the NASDAQ down 4%. That's part of a slide that's been continuing all month long. And today we got another report from a major big tech company, Alphabet, the parent company of Google, missed expectations on earnings, especially when it came to the ad revenue for YouTube. So a lot of concerns about Wall Street about where growth will come from and also inflation.
Frank Holland, thank you for that breakdown. Always great to see you. Appreciate it. You heard Frank talking about tech stocks, right? Twitter stock was also down about 4% today. It would be kind of a moot point once Elon Musk takes over, right, and takes it private. Today, Musk is doubling down, if you will, on his calls for free speech a day after he bought Twitter. And critics started asking, OK, Elon Musk, what exactly does free speech mean to you? He's tweeting this afternoon, the extreme antibody reaction from those who fear free speech says it all. So what is Twitter going to look like under Musk? It's a political question. Now, you had Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer sharing his concerns about it just a few hours ago. Watch.
In many ways, Twitter has been a dark, dark place. I hope it doesn't get any darker.
Joel and Kent is joining us now all over this story once again this evening. And Joe, some have pointed out free speech might mean different things to different people, right? And with Musk taking over Twitter now, set to take over Twitter. It's not a done deal yet. He's at the center of this whole discussion. How does this navigation happen here?
Well, it's subject to regulatory and shareholder approval. We're expecting that to take months. And so in the meantime, Elon's going to Elon. I mean, that's really what he's going to do. And what we've seen so far in recent days is he's taken to Twitter, as he usually does, to make his position known. Now, in addition to the tweet that you just shared, he's also now sort of clarifying on Twitter what he means by free speech, which he says is the reason he entered into this takeover agreement to begin with. And he was tweeting earlier today his clarification. He says, by free speech, I simply mean that which matches the law. I am against censorship that goes far beyond the law. So it almost feels like he's speaking not just to his worst critics, as he called them out yesterday, but also speaking to regulatory members of regulatory agencies that will be looking this over. But He's not one to mince words. He's also been calling the SEC names, the San Francisco office in particular. And so this could very well continue to be a roller coaster, as it already has been for several weeks, Hallie.
Yeah, could very well continue. It's gonna, because as you say, Joe, Elon's gonna Elon, right? But you also have this interesting dynamic from where I sit here in Washington as it relates to members of Congress. You had Democrat Ro Khanna just today, who obviously represents some of these, Northern California companies and citizens, who's saying, hey, we're a little concerned about this, right? It's deja vu for those of us who cover the intersection of tech and policy in Washington, because they've been talking about concerns with social media companies for years, and there's been very little concrete action in Washington. So what are the tools in their toolbox if members of Congress really are worried about Musk's takeover here?
Members of Congress can always put pressure on those that they have alliances with in these regulatory bodies to scrutinize Twitter in a way that they believe it ought to be scrutinized as it navigates this regulatory path ahead. The other thing that they can do is try to haul Elon Musk in front of Congress. Now, that has usually been reserved for the CEOs of these large tech companies like Meta/Facebook and Twitter and Google. But, Elon Musk being so involved and saying he's going to implement specific things in his confirmation that the deal is happening. Look, they could very much get him in front of Congress. But he's also said today, in response to someone on Twitter who was saying, look, you're going to be hauled in front of Congress for 60 million different things. He tweeted an emoji with two stars in the eyes. So he doesn't seem afraid of that.
It's going to be a spectacle. Listen, we've seen some of these high-profile Facebook and Twitter and Instagram people, not Elon Musk. So when he comes, it's going to be a zoo if that happens. Yeah,
I like that you just said when he comes, because that very much is the feeling among journalists who cover this, myself included, is that, he is entering a new space. He may be the head of Tesla and SpaceX, but this is a whole different banana. This is a very big challenge. It comes with a lot more scrutiny.
Joe Lincoln, great to see you. Thank you.
Good to see you, too.
Staying in Washington, the Supreme Court justices today seemed kind of open to letting the Biden administration end the Remain in Mexico policy. You know this policy. It was put in place under former President Donald Trump. It all came during 2 hours of arguments, hours after Texas and Missouri sued to try to keep this program in place. The policy says that migrants who want asylum at the southern border have to stay in Mexico. They have to remain in Mexico while the U.S. processes their claims. The questioning today focused really on how limited the capacity is for the U.S. to keep asylum seekers, to detain them crossing the border, and how the policy has affected foreign policy relations with Mexico. Here's a little bit of an exchange on that. Listen.
Nothing about this injunction actually requires negotiation with a foreign power, but in the extent that to some extent this court thought that it did, of course, the foreign affairs power is shared between Congress.
I'm sorry, I have to stop you there, General, and you can get the other 4 questions. But what do you mean it doesn't require negotiation with the foreign power? What are we supposed to do? Just drive truckloads of people into Mexico and leave them without negotiating with Mexico?
A little bit of what it was like in arguments there. Let me bring in now our justice correspondent, Pete Williams, to talk us through it. I often ask you to read the tea leaves, and you often graciously indulge me on that front. It seems like all the signals point to the justices, if you listen to that exchange, likely keeping this in place, which is sort of interesting considering how conservative the court is right now.
Well, not keeping the Remain in Mexico program in place.
Allowing the Biden, right.
Yes, allowing Biden to shut it down. Right. And that seemed to me where the court was headed today. I mean, the problem is this, and both sides concede this. There simply aren't enough beds. There isn't enough detention space to detain, to hold everybody who comes into the U.S. while they wait for their asylum claims to be considered. So the question is, what do you do with them? Right. Texas and Missouri, which sued to keep this program going, say, well, the answer is clear. You must detain. If you can't detain, you have to send them to Mexico to wait. The Biden administration, as every other administration, says, no, we can allow people to remain in the U.S., parole them in is the legal term, as long as they don't have a criminal history, they don't have a danger of absconding, they're not a threat to national security. Now, there's some skepticism about that because there are thousands of people that are paroled in. Some of the justices said today, what kind of scrutiny is that? Sam Alito said, I doubt it's any more so than what you give people who show up at Nats Park. Do you have a ticket? Do you have something you're going to throw on the field? No? OK, you're in. But the government says no, it is a case-by-case thing. But that's what it really comes down to. And, you asked me to read the tea leaves. So here's my Orange Pico reading here. Is I think a majority of the court's going to say that there is a provision in the law that says the government can parole people in, doesn't have to send them back to Mexico. if there is a substantial public benefit to that. And the benefit would be, not having to allow Mexico to set the terms of what we're going to do if we have to send people back to Mexico. That's what you were getting at with the soundbite there from Elena Kagan. So for all those reasons, it did seem that the court, although they had tough questions for both sides, is going to let the Biden administration shut this down.
So the practical implication of that would be allowing potentially more people to be paroled into the U.S. who are seeking asylum.
Correct. And then we get, though, to the COVID thing, which is, going to be, by the time this gets decided in June, I think it's going to be sort of a footnote to the legal battle over, can the Biden administration shut down this Title 42 thing, which says people that have COVID or are suspected of it, or because we are dealing with a pandemic, can't come into the U.S. And the Biden administration has said it wants to shut it down in May. 21 states have gone to federal court and said, no, you can't do that. And I think that's going to be the next battle. And I'm not sure whether it'll wind up in the Supreme Court next term or not.
Why do you think that would supersede this discussion as it relates to Remain in Mexico?
Well, because Remain in Mexico was basically, it became sort of a non-issue. Yes, the history here is a bit complicated. So Trump starts it. Something like 70,000 people are shuttled back to Mexico. Biden stops it. The lower courts, in response to this lawsuit from Texas and Missouri, say, no, you have to start it up again. But then along comes Title 42.
Because of COVID, the pandemic hits, and that's that.
Right.
Pete Williams, we could talk for an hour. Sadly, we're out of time. Indulge me next time, though.
I'll come to the House.
Thank you, Pete. Appreciate it. Lawyers for a man charged in the January 6 attacks listen to this. They're claiming he was acting in self-defense against the Capitol Police. This is retired New York police officer Thomas Webster. He's accused of assault and some other charges for attacking an officer using a flagpole. Both sides today using a kind of he started it strategy, each showing the jury videos of the confrontation. This first video from the prosecution. They say Webster was the aggressor. Webster, they say, was the one egging on police to take off their protective gear. And then you see it here, suddenly charged at them. But the defense showed this other video, Webster being hit in the face by a police officer, his lawyer saying he was trying to defend himself. Webster's charged with 6 counts, including assaulting or resisting officers with a deadly or dangerous weapon, disorderly conduct in a restricted building with the weapon, and violent entry on Capitol grounds. For the first time, the father of a teenage boy who fell to his death at a Florida amusement park ride visited the park where it happened. Tyree Sampson's father getting emotional as he stood in front of the memorial at Icon Park in Orlando just a couple hours ago. Sampson's family, you see that there. They're suing the park. They're suing the ride company and the ride's manufacturer, saying their son's life was needlessly cut short. Sampson's mother, back home in St. Louis, told reporters she's living a nightmare.
That Sunday, I was waiting for my son to come home because that's what he told me. I will see you Saturday or Sunday. So to get a call to say he's not coming back. I mean, I'm still like in shock. This is a nightmare. That's an extended nightmare, to be honest.
Sampson died last month on vacation with friends after he fell from that free fall ride in Orlando. A state report last week found that adjustments were made to the ride, letting it operate even though Sampson was not secure in his seat. Attorneys for the park and manufacturer of the ride have yet to respond to the lawsuit, but an attorney for the Slingshot Group said this week they followed all the ride's procedures and safety measures. Sam Brock is joining us now for this. And Sam, this is emotional for Tyree's parents, obviously, right? You heard from his mom calling it a nightmare. You've talked to his dad. We heard from him again today. What are they hoping to see from this lawsuit?
It's gut-wrenching, Hallie, and I think just the video you showed a second ago of Yarnell Sampson, his father, bent over at the waist. The first time that he had been to Icon Park since all of this happened tells you everything that you need to know. The answer to your question is they want to make sure that no other family, no other child is ever victimized by a tragedy like this ever again. And they feel like there are clear safeguards that could be fixed, places where there was systemic failure. And I'll give you an example. Tyree Sampson was 380 pounds. He was a football player, 6'2", very large for his age. And he showed up at this ride 100 pounds almost above what the manufacturer's weight limit was. And he was never weighed. And no one, apparently, according to the lawsuit, said anything in time to intervene here. How is that possible? You know, one of the attorneys for his mom mentioned the fact that you had a metal detector to make sure that people didn't have cell phones and keys in their pockets so it didn't fall out and hit someone during the ride. But there was no scale on the premises to be able to weigh someone who was clearly above the weight limit. That's one example. You also, Hallie, talked about a manual adjustment of the harness, the sensors on the harness that Tyree Sampson was making, or wearing, I should say. And according to this lawsuit, there were only 2 seats on the entire ride that were adjusted for larger people. So they moved the actual sensor itself and the harness. So instead of being 3 inches of a gap, it was 6 or 7 inches. And according to the attorney, ended up being about 10 or 11 inches that Tyree slipped out of on his way down from a 400-foot plus high ride, the highest free fall ride according to the company in the world. And this is the result. A family right now that's just trying to figure out, how do we reform this system so this never happens again to any other kids?
Yeah. It is such a, you said it, Sam, it is gut-wrenching, you know, and you think about others, the impact for other families, right? This family hoping to help other families, and what people should be thinking about as they're maybe heading to amusement parks this summer.
100%. And I think part of the problem here, Hallie, is that we found out today it's a state-by-state basis in terms of the safety regulations. It used to be in the hands of the federal government, but back in the 70s, at some point, that power was stripped from Congress. So what the family members right now, the parents of Tyree Sampson, want to see is uniform regulation and even application of the rules that do exist. Because I will tell you, on a couple of other rides, according to Tyree Sampson's friends and teammates, he was denied because of his weight. So why was that applied in some cases, but not fatally and fatefully in what happened on March 24th? One of the many questions right now that needs to be examined and answered.
Sam Brock, live for us there in Florida. Sam, thank you very much. Coming up here on the show, new guidance out about taking aspirin, what you should know before you reach for the bottle, and the 5 things. Plus, a big pilot shortage all across the country ahead of a busy summer travel season. We'll talk about what it might mean for your vacation plans next. All you super early risers and uber late night owls, get psyched, because just before 4 o'clock this morning, we're going to see something really interesting. This joint project between NASA and SpaceX, a launch. 4 astronauts, you see them right there. They're getting ready to go on a 6-month trip to the International Space Station. And as long as the weather cooperates, they should take off at 3:52 a.m. Aren't you up at 3:52 also? You're not? You don't have kids? The crew includes Jessica Watkins, who will be the first Black woman to head to the ISS. It's the latest in a pretty busy season for space travel. Just yesterday, Axiom and SpaceX's first all-civilian crew to the ISS splashed down off the coast of Florida after a 2-week trip. Speaking of things happening in the sky, airlines are saying things are going to start happening. It's going to start getting back to a post-pandemic normal. They're expecting their most profitable summer ever. They're expecting big money, but there's a catch. There's a pilot shortage that's getting worse that may make that a whole lot harder. We're talking about flight delays, cancellation, grounded fleets, and right now pretty much every single airline is scrambling. They're looking for pilots to fly their planes, with more than 14,000 openings for commercial pilots over the next 8 years. So that's the horizon there. It's already having an effect. In some smaller airports, it's so bad that some airlines are even getting in buses to replace planes for shorter routes. How about that? It's happening as, look at this chart here. You can see the number of people getting screened by TSA. We're almost at pre-pandemic levels when it comes to the sheer number of people who are at airports who are traveling. Let me bring in Carrie Sanders now. Carrie, you know, boy, did we hear the word shortages a lot in this pandemic, but pilot shortage, that's one that's kind of new, and it hits people right in their vacation days. You know what I mean? What are you hearing about the reasons for this and the solutions?
Well, when you look at the reasons, it is because during the pandemic, the airlines were in trouble, so they decided to offer buyouts, and pilots took it. Then you have the FAA regulation where when you turn 65, you can no longer fly as a commercial pilot. So that is a continual push out. And then you have the fact that there are more people who want to go from point A to point B. The military once provided most of the pilots that transitioned from the military commercial, not happening as much. And so you have people who are wanting to become pilots, but maybe not enough who want to become pilots. And so you have this shortage. We had an opportunity to talk to some of those who are in the pipeline right now. Gabriela Lanzon, who's 29 years old. She's Venezuelan American. Her father was a pilot. Her grandfather was a pilot. And now her goal is, in the midst right now, she's training to try and make her way into the cockpit of a commercial airline.
Airlines are, you know, being a bit more flexible with when we talk about requirements that you need to have, or experience maybe, or maybe they used to request a bachelor's degree, and now they're being more flexible.
And to that point, you have Delta Airlines that once required a 4-year degree. They have decided to waive that so that they can get more people who are pilots that maybe didn't go to college and get a 4-year degree into the pipeline, Hallie.
You know, the impact on travelers, right? The impact on consumers. I have to think if people wanted to take a bus, they would have booked a bus. They booked a flight for a reason, right? But the shortage is getting so bad that in some places we're seeing the alternate mode of transportation happening. Do you think that's going to continue? Is that the sense you get from your reporting on this?
Yeah, I mean, you can't just invent pilots. There's so much training that happens. It takes a while to do this. So if you show up in Allentown and you're on an American flight, you're going to get a bus from Allentown to Philadelphia, which is a hub, and get on an American flight. Same sort of thing happening with United out for those in the small towns making their way to Denver. And nobody expects that. And as much as there's talk about this, and, you know, you might even get an email from the airline that you may read to tell you that when you get to the airport that you're going to be in bus, there are still folks who are going to be like, what? I bought an airline ticket. I printed it off the internet. It's in my phone. I thought I was getting on what we call a puddle jumper, a smaller plane to get to the hub to continue on. I didn't bargain for getting on a bus. But that's the reality.
Timeline-wise, we talked about all these opening, you know, I think it was 14,000 over the next 8 years. How long are we going to have to wait before the pipeline kind of catches up to the demand here, Kerry?
Well, that's really interesting because the airlines recognize they have a problem. I mean, JetBlue today announced that you don't hear this from airlines, that they are not expecting a lot of growth in their airlines. Airlines like to project growth year over year. They're not expecting much, but what JetBlue is doing, what United is doing, is they're actually opening up flight academies. And so if you are somebody that has the propensity to want to become a pilot, which if you did it on your own could cost tens of thousands, if not more than $100,000, you can get into these academies that the airlines are starting to train you, and you don't have to have flight experience, to train you all the way up to becoming a commercial pilot. So the time horizon, you know, nobody's really putting a check mark on it to say, well, next year things will be better. But it takes a while, and I have a feeling that if we're seeing airlines admit that they're not going to have growth, no matter what flight you're going to get on, assuming there's a pilot, you can expect every seat is going to be filled. Hallie?
Awesome for the frequent flyers among us. Kerry Sanders, you're one of them. Thank you very much. Appreciate it. Let's get you over to the 5 things our team thinks you should know about tonight. Number 1, a Florida judge ruled jury selection in the case of the Parkland school shooter has to start over. 11 potential jurors were excused earlier this month, with one state official saying mistakes were made. This means opening statements in the trial are going to end up pushed back to late June. Number 2, 2 wildfires have combined into one mega fire in New Mexico, burning something like 56,000 acres so far. Officials have only got a handle on just about a quarter of it. You've also got fires ripping through Arizona and Nebraska now, too. Number 3, Olympic gold medalist Chloe Kim says she's taking the season off to focus on her mental health. The snowboarder says she wants to reset. You know Kim, right? You remember her. She became the youngest woman to win gold at the 2018 Winter Olympics, and she defended her title at the Beijing Games. She says she hopes to be back for the 2026 Games in Italy. Number 4, new recommendations out say aspirin could actually hurt more than it helps some adults. Health experts now say people over the age of 60 should not take a daily aspirin to prevent a first heart attack or stroke. Why? They say it can actually boost the risk of potential brain bleeding or stomach bleeding. Obviously, you should talk to your doctor about caring for your heart. That's what the guidelines say, so do that. Number 5, actor Cary Elwes was hospitalized after he was bitten by a rattlesnake in California. Do you recognize him? Did you watch The Princess Bride? That's him. He was doing some yard work when it happened. He says he's doing fine. That's a good thing. He even joked about it on social media, saying he wasn't bit by a rouse. And for all of you Princess Bride fans out there, you know that means rodent of unusual size. Still to come. We're still in this pandemic, and the burnout is real. And according to some new reporting, it's especially real for women who work. We've got more in the backstory after the break. In an NBC News exclusive, we are hearing from an oligarch in Russia taking kind of a risk, speaking out against Vladimir Putin for the country's invasion of Ukraine. We'll see this first on this show in the original, coming up in just a couple of minutes. But first, it's time to get the backstory, our behind-the-scenes look at how a story comes together and how it fits into our bigger picture. And tonight, we're talking about burnout. something one working mom from Maryland, Julia Martin, has felt throughout the pandemic, given her youngest child is too little for vaccines. And then on the other side, at work, she's got this constant pressure to always be on. Well, now, this new survey that NBC News got a first look at from Deloitte heard from thousands of working women. They found that during the pandemic, the pressure has only gotten worse. They're calling it a full-on burnout epidemic. Here's what's happening. More than half of women report stress levels higher than they were a year ago. Right? So think about where you were a year ago and how stressed you were. Is it worse now? A lot of women say yes. Fewer than half of women feel like they're getting enough mental health support from the people they work for, their employers. And even less, only 33% of women have actually taken time off to deal with those challenges. And it's all of these factors that have a lot of women thinking about quitting their jobs or maybe quitting any job altogether, leaving the workforce. Hallie is the one who reported on this, got her hands on this new reporting. Hallie, you've been following, I know, one woman for, I think, a year now, right? This woman in Maryland. You've been covering this for a long time. What was it about this story that made you say, OK, I need to share this. I need to shine a spotlight on this?
Well, this has been going on for me even before the year mark with Julia, who I did speak to last May and now again just a week ago. This was really at the beginning of the pandemic. I was talking with my producer at the time, Molly Roker, about the conversations we were having with our girlfriends and our friends who were parents and who were feeling this pull in the early days of the pandemic of, you know, maybe their husband had their health care and so they couldn't have him leave the workforce, but they needed to scale back because their kids were no longer in places where they had childcare. You know, this was something that I think was organic for me in seeing this in the conversations. And then you saw it in the data that we were getting in the early days of the pandemic, that Black women were being forced to shutter their businesses at higher rates than other businesses, that PPP loans were going to more white male-dominated companies. All of this is how it came together. And I think it's still not in the forefront of the conversation because we've gone past that initial wave of, oh, my God, this crazy thing is happening.
Right. Crisis, crisis, crisis.
But we got to stay on it. And this study lets us do that.
Well, it's a simmering crisis. And for viewers of this show, they'll know that we talk about mental health a lot. I count myself among the 33% of working women who took time off and had the privilege to take time off to deal with some of that, like mental health stuff. So many women can't do that. And so many women, I think, are rightfully and validly don't want to talk about it, right? Don't want to share about it. How did you get some of these women to talk with you? Like, you're coming into their space, you've got a camera, you've got a producer, and you're saying, be really vulnerable.
Yes, you are. But I think the thing that has been so stunning to me in doing a lot of these stories is a lot of these women are open to sharing their experiences because they know that it can help other women. What I hear in all these conversations is, oh, this is what I talk about in my text chains all the time, right? And the reason that I wanted to do these stories is because I think that television provides us a platform where we can make a lot of people feel seen. And in those early days of the pandemic especially, we were all so isolated and we thought that the problems that we were dealing with were our own. And the moms who I would hear from after these stories would air would say, you made me feel a little bit less alone in my struggle today. And that means the world when you can highlight that and you can go into these places and ask people to be vulnerable because there's a payoff to that.
I think the hard thing for some people when they're looking at this is, okay, we actually have heard a lot about working women, moms, also, you know, women who aren't moms, women who are moms but don't work, right? Like lots of people are having a really tough time and have been having a really tough time, right? It is simmering, it is simmering, it is boiling, it is boiling. But what's the solution? And that's what I think feels frustrating for a lot of women. What is in your notebook, right? What's the next story that you're going to tell? Is it going, you know, deeper into what employers need to do, right? Like what the people who are the bosses need to be doing for women who are in these positions. Like what's next?
Yeah, I think that I really want to do that story of like the employers who are doing it right, because even in the Deloitte study, they talk about 4 or now 5% of companies that are inclusive and that are making women feel seen in the workplace. That's great. But I also got an email today that made me wonder if I should take gender from the other side of the coin that we don't often talk about, which is men. And I got an email today that said, well, everyone's burnt out. It's not just women. And certainly I expected to get an email like that. And I'm actually glad I did, because it allows us to say that just because we're doing a study on women doesn't mean that other people aren't burnt out and aren't feeling the same pressures. It just means that women are held to different societal standards. We know that data says that they do more of the invisible labor at home. So they're doing this work already. It is different to be female in this moment. At the same time, though, I do think that there are some men who responded to me and said, well, I feel a different push and pull, that I can't be vulnerable because of unfair toxic masculinity standards in society. And I think that when we look at gender, we only look at it from a female perspective, and I fall prey to this too. But maybe looking at it from the male perspective of what are the constraints that we're also applying to men in this moment that are maybe not making them their best partners at home.
Come back. Tell us more about it.
I will. This is a good brainstorm.
Hallie Vitale, thank you so much for opening up your, I say reporter's notebook. Who has a notebook? Your phone, right? Your apps, and sharing more with us. Appreciate it, girl.
Thanks.
We've got some breaking news coming into us just in the last couple of minutes, actually, on the COVID front, because Pfizer is now asking the FDA to authorize a third dose of its vaccine for kids ages 5 to 11. The company is saying they don't have any safety concerns from their latest trial. Remember, the FDA authorized third doses for children ages 12 to 15 in January. We don't know some of the details here, like whether or if the FDA Advisory Committee will meet to talk about the data. We're going to stay on top of that. We'll bring you any developments as we get them. Still ahead, did you hear about this? Congressman Madison Cawthorn in a little bit of trouble for bringing a loaded gun to an airport. We've got those details next in the local. Plus, an NBC News exclusive. Our Tom Winter traveling overseas to sit down with an oligarch who's speaking out about Russia's attack on his homeland. That's tonight's original. Harvard University today saying it's going to confront, it's going to take on really directly its ties to slavery. And the school's committing a lot of money to try to make things right. We're going to explain a little later. But first, NBC News covers hundreds of stories every day. And because you couldn't possibly read or watch or listen to them all, our bureau teams have done it for you. This is what they tell us is going down in their regions in a segment we call The Local. From our West Coast Bureau, a 3-month-old baby who was allegedly kidnapped yesterday in California has been found alive. This whole thing apparently went down while the grandmother was unloading groceries from her car. Police say 3 suspects are in custody and that baby Brandon is being checked out at a local hospital. From our Southeast Bureau, Congressman Madison Cawthorn cited today on a misdemeanor criminal charge for bringing a loaded gun to the Charlotte airport. It's actually the second time the GOP lawmaker has been stopped at an airport in his home state for carrying a weapon. Cawthorn, you may remember, got into a little bit of hot water not too long ago for driving without a valid license. And from our Midwest Bureau, Chicago officials are trying to figure out why a man stole an ambulance and then took it on a joyride for 70 miles. This is it. That ambulance is going fast. It ended up blowing a tire, so this guy jumped out and ran. He's now in custody, but hasn't said why he did it. So tonight's original now, with in-depth reporting on a topic we've been keeping an eye on. And tonight, an NBC News exclusive about a Russian oligarch changing his tune. Dmitry Firtash, he's a Ukrainian billionaire, an oligarch, right, who's now speaking out against Vladimir Putin, something he acknowledges comes with risks. He appeared in both Special Counsel Robert Mueller's investigation and the first impeachment of President Donald Trump. So if his name sounds familiar, that's why. For years, he was a supporter of Russia. He was a supporter of pro-Russian causes in Ukraine. But now, with his home country under attack, he's saying something a little different. Here's our Tom Winter with more.
What has your reaction been to what you've seen going on in your homeland?
I want to cry. It tears apart my soul. What other reaction could I have?
One of the richest men in Ukraine, Dmitry Firtash, made billions in natural gas, mining, and agriculture, and long supported pro-Putin political forces in Kyiv.
To believe that in 2022, in the center of Europe, that such a massacre can be taking place, no normal person could believe it.
Firtash has made a career of trying to bet on the right party, the right player.
I was never pro-Russian, but you have to understand that I'm a businessman, and my goal is to earn money.
So now Firtash is doing something he's never publicly done before, taking aim at Vladimir Putin.
He is never going to come out victorious. No matter what happens, Russia will lose.
If you could pick up the phone and call him, what would you tell him?
It's time to stop. There will be no victory. The longer this war takes, the worse it will be for the Russian people.
Do you think speaking out and saying what you've said today about what Russia's doing, that your personal safety is a concern?
I don't really have a choice.
Putin's wrath isn't the only risk he faces. Here in the U.S., he's accused by federal prosecutors of conspiring to pay bribes abroad to ultimately secure a deal to supply a specialized metal for Boeing's 787 Dreamliner and is fighting extradition in Austria. After paying the largest bail bond in Austrian history, nearly $174 million, Firtash has been living at this villa under house arrest for the last 8 years here in Vienna. What do you say to the indictment against you?
100% not guilty.
In that case, there's a specific filing that says you're an upper echelon associate of Russian organized crime. What's your response?
As I discussed with you, Ed, we are in the middle of a criminal case. How improper that statement in open court was, and we've instructed Mr. Firtash not to dignify it by answering.
That's Lanny Davis, former Clinton spokesperson during the Monica Lewinsky scandal, now representing Firtash. Firtash has other connections to U.S. politics. During the 2020 presidential campaign, Rudy Giuliani held up a memo prepared for Firtash's Austrian attorneys as part of an effort to fight his extradition. The memo from Ukraine's former chief prosecutor talking about Hunter Biden.
Your name came up in connection with the impeachment of then President Trump, specifically an effort to dig up dirt on Hunter Biden. Did you ever try to do that?
I never took part in the digging up of information, whether it be on Trump or Biden. The fact that I'm being dragged into this whole situation connected to Giuliani, I never met him, not by phone nor in person.
And have prosecutors reached out to you about the Giuliani investigation?
Never.
Firtash's name also came up during the Mueller probe. Investigators wanted Firtash to be a cooperating witness to provide info on a Trump insider he'd known for years, Paul Manafort. Court filings show the two pursued but didn't complete a deal to develop a hotel in New York City.
All I can say is that I never did business with Manafort. They never received money from me.
You know, you say that, and I have sitting here today a document on your own letterhead. And you just told me you've never done business with Paul Manafort, but this is an agreement to do business.
The project wasn't of any interest to us, and we refused it.
Mr. Firtash, the U.S. says you're a criminal. They allege you're an organized crime. Your homeland has you sanctioned. Why is it, do you think, so many people allege so many bad things about you?
You know, when you want to know something about a person, you should look at who his enemies are, and then you can judge what this person is worth.
Firtash says he'd rather go back to Ukraine right now and fight, if prosecutors would let him, and experience what he calls the new Ukraine.
We have to say a big thank you to Mr. Putin, and I believe we should be building him a monument in the very center of Ukraine, because he turned out to be the only politician that in the last 30 years managed to unite the country as one whole.
Tom Winter is back from his reporting trip to Vienna. He is joining us now. Tom, that was a fascinating look at Dmitry Firtash, who I know you've been talking about for years, because we've talked about it for years here. You know, and I misspoke when I called him a Russian oligarch, obviously Ukrainian, but pro-Russian, although he says he's not. You talked to them for hours, I think several hours, right? What's he doing now? What's left in your, reporter's notebook, as we like to say here on the show?
Sure, Hallie. So a couple of interesting things. First off, we met initially in his conference room, and as you know, I've been reporting on him for the last 6 years, so it was a moment, because he's been very well aware that I've been reporting on him for the last 6 years. He's spending his time these days, Hallie, focused on a 24-hour kind of a cable news network. He's teamed up with his competitors in Ukraine, kind of like if we teamed up with CNN and Fox to put together what is essentially a public service 24-hour network with the Zelensky administration, focusing on several different things, but really just information that helps the Ukrainians get through this war, get through kind of the day-to-day battle that they're enduring with Russia. They also have a 24-hour Russian version of this that they say they're hoping gets into Russia via YouTube, so people there can see what's really going on. He's got maybe one or two options left on appeals or challenges to this extradition, and it's possible, Hallie, before the year is out, he could be in an American courtroom.
Tom Winter, if he is, I know you will be outside of it. Thank you so much for being with us and for bringing the story to us here on the show. Thanks. Coming up after the break, Harvard University trying to right some wrongs by addressing its ties to slavery. We'll explain what they're doing and the reaction next. Harvard University has been proud of its motto for a long time, veritas, the Latin word for truth. Well, today, the school is exploring a painful fact of its truth, that much of its wealth is because of people who exploited Black and Native American enslaved people. It's all laid out in a 134-page report that's setting up the, quote, Legacy of Slavery Fund. And Harvard's president, saying today the school benefited and perpetuated practices that, in his words, were profoundly immoral.
The truth is that we must do what we can to address the persistent corrosive effects of historical practices on individuals, on Harvard, and on our society.
So to do that, Harvard's putting up $100 million, right, for plans that include making more educational opportunities, expanding partnerships with HBCUs, and honoring enslaved people. It does not include reparation. Let's be clear on that. We should also note that the $100 million, just putting out some numbers here, that is a fraction of Harvard's $53 billion endowment. I want to bring in George Solis, making his debut here on the show and here on NBC, one of our new correspondents. George, it's great to be with you. Thank you for joining us with your reporting on this, because there is some emotion in this, too, right? The report talking about the 70-plus people who were enslaved by Harvard leaders and staff, including 4 Harvard presidents. You talked with one of those descendants, right?
That's right, Hallie. Happy to be here. Now, these men, women, and children fed and cared for faculty, staff, and students at Harvard. The report also provides a bit more context how the university made tons of money from the slave trade industry. Now, also outlined the names of past presidents, faculty, and donors that enslaved people. Now, I spoke with Dennis Lloyd, who says his ancestor was owned by the family that essentially founded Harvard Law School. He called the report a step in the right direction.
It's an emotional trip. When I read, certainly some of the hardships that they went through, the type of, cruelty that they experienced, not as harsh, I'm sure, as working in the fields of Alabama and Mississippi, but, working on Brattle Street in Cambridge, had its very difficult times.
Now, Hallie, Lloyd went on to say, in one way, it does feel like reparations, but states that word can mean different things to different people. Nevertheless, it's an acknowledgement that does speak volumes.
You talk about this word, right, that word reparations, but as we said, this plan, it's not going to provide any direct payments to descendants of people who are enslaved. Did Harvard explain why not?
Yeah, Harvard did have an answer for that. They said they're setting aside that $100 million as a jumping-off point to address, as the university puts it, their reckoning and repair. Now, some of that money is already being made available to start funding programs that honor enslaved individuals, as well as finding ways to connect their descendants. The report also highlights recommendations to build partnerships with HBCUs, as well as create an endowment fund to support more programs that ultimately reveal the history of Harvard and its ties to slavery.
George Solis, thank you so much for being with us tonight here on the show. It's good to see you, and I'm sure we'll have you back soon. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Appreciate all of you for joining us, too, for another busy hour. They're all busy. We're going to have more busy ones for you tomorrow, same time, same place. Thanks for joining us. Coverage picks up right now.
Thanks for watching our YouTube channel. Follow today's top stories and breaking news by downloading the NBC News app.